In the past, many drivers jumped back and forth between F1 and other championships quite a bit. Jackie X, for instance, won Le Mans 6 times, Stefan Bell saw great success in sports car championships, and John Surtees even moved between motorbikes, F1 and Le Mans. However, Formula 1 drivers that recently made the move to other championships with comparatively lower downforce cars have particularly struggled. For example, Montoya in NASCAR, Ralf Schumacher in DTM, or Nigel Mansell in British touring cars. There are successful examples such as Nico Hülkenberg and Mark Webber in LMP1 or Montoya in IndyCar, but these are the exception rather than the rule. So the question is, why did these drivers struggle in other cars? There are multiple reasons for it, and they are mainly related to the car's significant differences in weight and downforce. We're going to explain the 5 key differences in driving style that help us understand why being good in F1 does not automatically translate to success in other championships. The first thing to note is an occasionally significant difference in racing lines. If we use the Nürburgring Grand Prix track's Turn 3 as an example, we can see that Formula 1 cars can take a significantly wider line than the line that we see in a DTM or in a GT car. Why is that? Unlike in lower downforce cars, an F1 car needs to keep its minimum speed through a corner as high as possible to ensure that its aerodynamic components are being utilized to their full effectiveness. Lower downforce cars, on the other hand, tend to dive into corners earlier and deeper by taking a so-called V-line. This difference is common across many tracks, and so it explains some of the driver's struggles. The second aspect that's quite different is steering consistency through a corner. Driving a Formula 1 car is all about leaning the car on one side and utilizing the aero to your advantage. As we can see from onboards, the drivers are relatively smooth on the steering with ideally only minor adjustment as they reach the limit. This is mainly due to the stiff and high downforce nature of F1 cars. However, in other series, we see that drivers swim a lot more and move around as they try to find the limit, as the cars have less grip, much softer suspension, and generally a wider grip window. So we talked about steering in general, but there's actually something else regarding turning that's quite different in non-F1 cars, and that is direction changes. In Formula 1, the cars can change direction much faster without understeering. This is thanks to the high downforce and stiff suspension. However, in cars with less downforce and much softer suspension, the car just takes a lot more time to shift the weight from one side to another during a change of direction. By applying the same technique as in F1, you would instantly cause a lower grip car to understeer and go off track. So we talked about racing lines as well as steering technique, but there is another fundamental difference in terms of F1 cars versus lower downforce ones, and that is around curb taking. Formula 1 cars have very low ground clearance, so as you can imagine, hitting even a small curb in one of these cars can drastically shift the balance of the car and even cause you to lose control as the car bottoms out. Furthermore, F1 cars are actually so sensitive that you can sometimes see drivers even avoid relatively flat curbs to aid the car's aerodynamic performance. However, by complete contrast, GT or Cup cars will eat even sausage curbs for breakfast wherever they can to extend the track, as this is simply down to the fact that the higher ground clearance does not affect the balance of the car quite as much as in F1. So we talked about driving style and driving technique, driving in isolation of others, but coming to the final point, and that is contact with others. As we have seen many times, touching an opponent in F1 will mostly have drastic consequences as someone losing the wheel. However, in series like the British Touring Car Championships, drivers are not shy to touch one another at all when racing. So coming from a strictly non-contact sport like F1 to BTCC like Nigel Mansell did would be like throwing Cristiano Ronaldo up against the All Blacks. As we have established then, there are significant differences between Formula 1 and many other racing championships that some drivers have stepped into, and we now know why these drivers struggle more as the car types get closer to the characteristics of a road car. The fact that a guy like René Rast has won DTM 3 times within 4 years is quite telling. Rast was renowned as a GT and Cup veteran before joining DTM, so you can see that there are some true experts in their field that just seem to be able to handle these cars' specific requirements much better than F1 drivers. Does all this mean F1 drivers can't do well in lower downforce categories? Of course not. As drivers like Pascal Wehrlein have shown, a switch between categories is still doable. Interestingly though, Formula E can be seen as quite a good middle ground as they use light, nimble cars like an F1 car, but with much less downforce and mechanical grip, perhaps closer to a GT car. Looking at the fact that all previous Formula E champions are ex-F1 drivers or test drivers, you can see how bridging the gap between categories can make things work for those drivers. So as Alex Albon moves towards DTM after being dropped from Red Bull in F1, and with DTM moving to GT3 based specification, we are really curious to see how well he can adjust his driving style going forward.